you don't want to separate the work from the artist, then? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because I don't think you can. Well, what I found helpful, and I'll give you a good example of what I mean by this. When I was an undergrad here at Cooper Union, this is 96 to 2000. So the tail end of the 90s, and the design on like the scene, you could say, was very edgy and very sort of expressive. Was kind of resurgence of this expressiveness. I'm thinking of like people like David Carson and like the deconstructivist stuff that was happening, coming out of Cranbrook and West Coast and surfing culture, and like there was just this like energy that was super interesting, and also a really vibrant new way of making graphics for and design for music. And I was enamored by all of this. I was a student. I was like, this is the work I want to make. And so,
Yeah.
in the space of Cooper Union or any institution, like you always are told of the alumni, the illustrious alumni of disciplines. And since I was going into design, I was well versed in like the illustrious alumni of design, Milton Glaser, Seymour Quast, and then certainly Lubalin. And when I saw Lubalin's work, I was aware, that work was significant, not really sure why, but it was like presented in the canon, and I just found it quite corny and quite dated because, at the time, through my youthful eyes, I was seeing this is cool, this is not, we're moving this way, this work is kind of fixed here, so let's go. So, and then I never really gave him a chance because I just saw it as this work. When I started working here as a curator in 2010, I was lucky to work with Adrian Shaughnessy and Tony Burke on the unit edition monograph about Herb Lubalin that came out, I am going to blank on the date, but somewhere around like 2012, maybe 13, something like that, a couple of years into my tenure here. And as part of the process of helping them fact check and do the kind of collection of material, and they shot the book here from the resources, I got to read a lot of stuff about Lubalin, and I poured over all of the articles of his speeches that he delivered, pieces that he wrote, mostly firsthand accounts, and kind of saw the relationship with Ginsburg, and all of these like objects came to light. And I had this epiphany of realizing, wow, this is like such a really interesting and nuanced person that I never gave a chance because the work seemed dated and kind of stilted to me. And I missed the forest for the trees because I was like, by understanding that designer better, I could see what he was doing, and I could see past the formal choices. I could see how that formal choice maybe stays in a particular year, particular time, style, because those are the tools they're using. They're using the sense of fashion that they have at the time. But you can look past that. You can actually look beyond those things because you can actually understand, okay, so he's doing this thing here in this moment, and I can see the thing that's often driving him, and I can apply that lens, and I can see the lesson. There's these objects that he did that just to sort of illustrate what I mean is what I understood Lubalin is he wanted things to have meaning.
Yeah, Sasha, let me, this is fascinating, but I just want to let the listeners know who the hell you are. Okay.
Sure.
And
Yes.
that's my problem. That's my fault. Okay, so Sasha Tochilovsky is a designer, typographer, instructor, and curator at the Cooper Union's Herb Lubalin Center of Design and Typography. He was born in Odessa and came to the States in 1989.
Correct.
And Herb Lubalin was a mid-20th century American graphic designer. He collaborated with Ralph Ginzburg on 3 of his magazines, Eros, Fact, and Avant Garde. And he designed the typeface ITC Avant Garde, and he was colorblind.
That's right. And ambidextrous.
So with that in place, yes, please continue.
All of those things about Lubalin are interesting to know. They're not like that's the thing that I'm recognizing, and I appreciate like that. All of those things are not just factoids, they're not just like biographical notes. Like I actually started to see how his colorblindness made certain choices, and how that informed his way of thinking in his work. Because I think that colorblindness for him, to connect to what I was saying earlier, he understood that people decode color and react and respond to color. Even if the colors he can't see, he knew that there's a symbolic quality to them. So he would assign colors to some of the work, even though sometimes he couldn't actually tell what those colors actually look like to him. But he knew that to others, they would have a certain resonance. And so he used color in this really incredibly interesting way, in a very symbolic way.
So it was more intellectual for him than physical.
Yes. Yeah. And again, like that was challenging my understanding of this like kind of quaint corniness. It was completely like blew my mind, because I was like, this is so sophisticated and so smart and so simple. Like the best example I can give you is the cover, the front cover and the back cover of Eros magazine, issue 2. The summer issue of 62, it has like a yellow and black on the front and the yellow and black on the back, 2 photographs of the beach.
It's the beach, right?
Beach on Coney Island. Yeah, it's a couple kind of making out on the beach in Coney Island. And the back is darker. The darker tones are sort of more dominant than the yellow tones. And then the end papers on either end of the book, connecting the case to the book, to the block, are one photo, close-ups of both end papers are close-ups of the couple. One is in red, one is in blue. The front one is in red, and the back one in blue. And I often think of Lubalin needs a reason. Often that's like, and sometimes it's just to satisfy his own decision making. What is this for? What does this mean? You can't just like blankly kind of put stuff like, oh, this looks nice here. So the way I read that is like, there's a day emphasized by the red photograph. It enhances kind of the summer heat and the passion of the couple. They're embracing.
The beach is yellow too, right?
The beach is yellow, right? So it's like it's setting the scene. And kind of setting the story. He's telling a mini story, and the story is like there's time, from the front of the magazine to the back of the magazine. That's why the front cover photo is yellow, and the blue suggests dusk, and then the photo after the blue page is the back cover, which is darker. So there's time lapsing through the magazine, because you've just spent a few seconds or a few minutes, a few hours going from the front cover to the back. And also the suggestion of the couple is still in love. So there's this timelessness to love.
Oh, yes, that's nice.
So I don't know. I think it's lovely. It's and I was like, this is, I can get by. I like this.
It's also, that's always great, isn't it? When there is something that underlying it. There is a storyline, or there is another level of thinking that the viewer, if they spend time with it, can cotton on to.
Yeah. And I think that he's very conscious especially in those publications that he did for Ralph Ginzburg, in what I think is a very good understanding of the relationship, of the dynamic as a designer in the role of an art director, is you have to have respect for the content, all of it. Even if it's content that you may disagree with, but it's you're hired to do this, and you have to respect the content, and you have to respect the reader. And so you're trying to make the best experience for the reader with this content, and saying like, this article is fantastic, I think you would appreciate it. How do I make that connection? And then he's very clear in those choices and in those. And that's, again, like what I really appreciate, because that to me is not about necessarily the style of that particular article. It's more about that, like, respect. What do we do as designers?
This is what a great writer does too. A great writer respects the reader to the point where they're not explaining everything. They know you're smart. They know you can fill in the blanks. So and in fact, it gives the reader something to do. This is what we want. We want to think. We want to join the dots ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about this is also this is where I feel like the understanding of biography of someone, a designer, and that's kind of my role, where I start to really get a sense of where that idea maybe got planted for him in his first part of his career, the time that he was starting to get attention and start winning awards. He was working for a studio called Sudler and Hennessy, and the studio that he was employed by after about 5 years out of college. 6 years out of college, he was hired by the studio, and the studio was only doing pharmaceutical design exclusively.
Yeah.
And the interesting aspect of pharmaceutical design in that period, this is before the 80s when pharma went big time to consumers or patient, consumer, slippage, whatever, right? All of the material was only sent to doctors. And they were in this like kind of perfect scenario where they knew where the material was going and they knew a lot about the doctor. They knew the demographic. And what you said just now is exactly what I think he experienced, is the sense, I have to make sure that this is sophisticated and smart and make them work a little bit for this, because they actually will appreciate the work involved in decoding, if you can say, an advertisement. But that plays into a bit of their ego and is like, oh, I connected the dots.
It's a feeling of satisfaction, isn't it?
Yeah, you've just bought them into this product.
Yeah.
And yes, it's an advertising tactic, but I think he can carry that over into his other work because he understands, like, you don't have to pander. You can make things smart, make them work a little bit, and they will actually respect you more for that, respect the material.
Well, you bring up, of course, I've watched most of the videos of you on YouTube. And in one case, you talk about the fact that Herb is just using typography in an ad, but some of the words are red, and you read it, you understand it that way, but there's another way of understanding it too, right? Maybe you could explain that.
This is actually, I think, to me, like in the timeline of his work, the pivot and the breakthrough that happened, where he, I think, started really focusing on typography as the main place of ideas. And he was making, up to that point, very nice, very well constructed, very beautiful ads that had kind of a little bit of a signature style. But like from that ad, the one you described, I think that changes his practice completely. And I think what he realized is the power of empowering language through the typography. The choices every designer has to make about the font that they use, because you have to make that choice. You have to have text on the page. You can make any font choice. And he realized just the purity and the simplicity of that font choice, just pausing with that. Hey, we make type choices. They're stylistic. But what I think happened to him is like, well, is it stylistic? What is there? And I think like that allowed him to kind of have that distance from this space of just like making, and realize that there's a potential in the choice. And he constructed this ad by essentially changing some of the words in the block of text. It's a little bit bigger than normal. It's just like a description about this drug. This drug does these things, very kind of bland copy, but by changing some of the words within that text into a different font and a different color, they pop, and you realize that they connect into a sentence. So he's embedding the headline. So the first read is the easy read. You see those words being larger, and you actually read them even though they're not in one line, which is transcending. Like no headline prior to this in advertising was like it's a child game he's playing, and he knows that you will play along because you're a rational person. You want to see this. So he gets you to read the headline instantly, even though it's actually not connected. And then you realize that the words around them are also read in lines. So you read it again. He gets you to read two pieces of text that are different in the same time, basically. So the ability to manipulate you as a reader, as a viewer, is profound with just the decision about a typeface, which is so simple. But I think, to what you said earlier is also, I think, interesting. Like the fact that he was ambidextrous, I feel, is it played a little bit of a role, because he was a lefty, mostly. So he wrote with his left hand, but he always drew with his right. And I think about that as a mechanics, because typography is not writing in a way. So when he was sketching with text, he's doing this with his right hand, which is more of a drawing process to him. If he's writing a note, he's quickly writing it with his left. But if he's actually drawing letter forms in designs, I think he's doing it with his right, which means he's more focused on the shapes of them and the abstraction of them. And that allows him to kind of see the difference between what words mean and what they look like. And I think that led him to see typography in the formal way. He's kind of able to just suspend that sense of I think he stops reading and sees words for shapes and like, wow, look at this A. It has a triangle inside, or an O. It has a space if I put a face in it. He had this piece which was like an IQ. I don't know what it's for, but it's a Q, capital Q, and inside the Q is an image of an eye, like a rebus. But he's like, oh, there's space. What can I do with that space?
It's funny. I mean, I've taken a few drawing classes, and one exercise in quite a well-known book. I'm trying to remember, like Natural Drawing or something like that. Anyway, and it gets you to use your wrong hand to draw a picture of Stravinsky, I think it is, and. And what you do is, you just see it as a bunch of lines at different angles, and your rational brain doesn't try to correct you. All you're doing is copying, an angle of a line.
Mm-hmm. And I think in a way, for him, he wasn't like super conscious of all of the stuff. I think it was just part of how he was built, and so this ambidextrousness, the feedback to his brain, made different things apparent, and the color blindness made him make certain color choices. It was always,
it's almost like these two sort of characteristics enable him to get above it all,
mm-hmm.
in a weird way.
And you could say kind of handicaps, because certainly in that time that was seen. He struggled in school. He says this in his like biographies and interviews. He was like, I almost got flunked out of Cooper Union. He because he struggled, and one of the things that they had to do in that time, they had to take a lot of lettering courses. That was like a way that you had to take lettering first year, you had to do some in second year. And
what is Sasha? What is lettering exactly?
That's a great question. I mean, lettering in that time, and certainly I think has had a resurgence. Lettering in a way is drawing letters that isn't handwriting, nor is it something that's typeset. So it's something that lives between handwriting, calligraphy, and handwriting, and typeset things with fonts, which are repeatable. So handwriting is unique. Fonts are repeatable, always the same. And lettering is like drawing letters in a particular context that they live in, a particular word, making it fit really well together. It's unique to that sort of presentation within that mode. And so,
are you trying to copy a set typeface? Is that what you're trying to do with your drawing?
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes lettering is like being able to replicate a style of a typeface, let's say, or font, or calligraphy, perhaps like a 15th century scribe, or like a Gothic kind of black letter style, but do it in a way that's inherently kind of unique and allows you to improve perhaps on the way that like some letters might fit in the font. So typically lettering is done for like a book cover. Certainly in the 40s and the 50s, most of those were hand lettered. A lot of headlines in magazines were hand lettered because it was faster than getting a typeset. You just have someone in the studio, which in the studios they had something called the bullpen, like the baseball analogy. It was like a group of skilled craftsmen, draftsmen, artists who could be called on like a project. We need this illustration, we need this lettering, here's the text. So they would draw things, and they would make really nice combinations of letter forms that like were more succinct and more harmonious than if they were just maybe typeset.
Okay. Dwiggins is known for this sort of calligraphy, lettering, right?
Yeah. Wiggins was someone who kind of spanned the spectrum of those crafts. He was very skilled at calligraphy. He was very skilled at lettering, and he was very skilled in making type. And a book designer and a puppet maker.
Maybe you could tell me a bit about Cooper Union, because that's where you are, and that's where Herb Lubalin went to school. Like, can you give me a quick little potted history about what it is, what it does, who graduated, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Cooper Union was named after Peter Cooper, and the union in that title was the Union of Art and Science, essentially. Cooper Union was created by Peter in 1859, or the school opened its doors in 1859 to give people the ability to learn important skills and be able to kind of progress into the middle class through free education. Peter Cooper was inspired by the Polytechnic Institute, I believe, in Paris, which was essentially kind of like a skilled trade school in engineering, essentially. And he saw, like, there's this burgeoning field of engineering. If we can train engineers for free, that they don't have to pay, they will improve the city.
What kind of skills?
For Peter Cooper, like he worked as an apprentice to a coachmaker. I think he had only a few grades of school. He had to teach himself how to read and write later. Like, so he started working as a child, missed a big part of schooling and didn't have reading and writing until later. And he always lamented the fact, like, this is wrong. Kids should be in school and not be working, and you should acquire these skills and intellectual abilities and intellectual thinking. And there should be places where people can go that don't cost anything. And he was an inventor. So I think he saw, like, there should be places where people could be trained and taught to invent things and improve the life of others. And so I think engineering to him was this, like, field where you can make improvements in people's lives. He had a factory that built cast iron, and they rolled I-beams. There's one of the first to make I-beams, which then became essential in the construction of cast iron buildings in New York, certainly, and other places. But the structural element, and I think he saw this, like, that's what an engineer does. Conceives a form that's essential to a new type of building that replaces wood, maybe, or fixes some of these problems, and the world progresses. Everyone benefits from these things. And so I think he put a lot of value in this inventiveness, and he wanted to create a space where that can happen to a great number of people that would get something that he didn't get as a child, But he was also very attuned to the role of art and architecture, which to him, I think, was the connection between the fine arts and engineering. Especially from the standpoint of the building of New York City and all those things, where he saw the creative role that art plays and in terms of communicating and also as a place for women to gain a foothold in the industry, which was certainly closed to unless it's like sweatshop labor. The professional track for women was quite restricting, and he saw that, like, through art making, because he was introduced to this women's art school, which was in the neighborhood, which was not far, who needed a physical space, and he basically took them into Cooper Union, gave him space, and then after a few years, that school was absorbed into the Cooper Union as the women's art school. And so it was one of the first, it's not the first in America, but, like, I would say something like the second or the third school, specifically a place of learning, a trade for women.
What kind of trades?
So the way that they saw themselves is, like, there were programs allowing women to study art, but they were mostly presented as a hobby. If you're middle class, upper class, you have free time and you go and you paint And these schools, a few of these, including this women's art school in New York, saw themselves as being able to give women a career. And what that meant is like they were trained in art, in the classic Beaux-Arts kind of model of you study from these busts, you study from these paintings, you replicate them, you're given the skills of draftsmanship, and then you can go and work. One of the places you could work is making illustrations. Let's say illustrations, engravings for publications, like let's say Puck Magazine, which was down the street. They would hire, sometimes I would say freelance on assignments. We needed image of, I don't know, someone on a horse because we're writing the story, whatever it is that was the article. They would give these assignments and women would be making those engravings. So the women were taught how to make an image and then how to make the image into an engraving so that these things could be published. Or working at places like Tiffany's, making the designs. Tiffany had like a big roster of women who were making the stained glass design for a lot of the lamps that Tiffany was producing. Some of the stained glass windows, but definitely the shades. You know, this new amazing collection of material that Tiffany was making was the head of the design sort of that was a woman, and there were quite a few alumni of Cooper Union, of this women's art school, that went to work there. Tiffany made it very obvious that he appreciated the leadership of this woman. And I'm blanking on her name. I should know her name. But she was empowered to kind of run this little department, and she brought in a lot of other women. And so they were very viable career paths if you had the right skills.
Book cover decoration as well, possibly.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the 20s, or even before that, in the late 19th century, they would do abstract designs when book covers weren't printed with like the way that we conceive covers, where they're more decorated. And then eventually into making images for book covers. So that definitely, and then that basically became the core of how Cooper Union taught students in the first few years. That's why lettering was such an important part, because getting a job in publishing of books, if you could do lettering, you can get assignments. And that's how a lot of women got placements. They could do these things essentially kind of freelance. They could be at home raising a family, which is what happened. A lot of women who were in the field in the 30s, 40s, 50s, in the book publishing space, were working from home, keeping the household, but would have a little studio space in the house, and they would be writing, drawing, lettering, making illustrations for book covers on assignment. But the most important thing I wanted to add is like the Cooper Union was free tuition since day one in 1859, all the way up into the more recent times when unfortunately they went to tuition, although they're on a 10-year plan to be back to free, which they will be free at some point soon.
I was just going to add that Richard Minsky came out with a lovely book on these sort of decorated book covers that from that era. Yeah, it's beautiful. So, okay. So Herb went to Cooper Union, and then he became entranced by typography. Why?
According to him, he wasn't doing well in his first years of study, and because there was such a heavy emphasis on writing letter forms, being left-handed was not great. Like left-handers typically, because you're writing against the page, and your hand essentially could smudge and will smudge. So there was this, like, any left-hander who went to calligraphy, the teachers were like, and this I've heard this from multiple people who went to Cooper, they're like, they get a pat on the back and they say, this is going to be impossible for you, so I'm just going to give you a lot of slack here. Do the best you can. I won't judge you harshly. And it was very pejorative, like, try hard, you're still going to fail. It's not for you. Very classic, kind of harsh. And he had this very similar experience, although what he did, he had the teacher who's like, do the best you can. I'll give you sort of more credit for the quality of the work that you'll produce, because I know it's going to be hard for you to do with the left hand. What Lubalin says he did is he was like, I just didn't tell them that I was ambidextrous. They expected me to do this left-handed. I did it right-handed, because I would draw right-handed. And in a way, it makes sense. Calligraphy is closer to drawing in a way, because you're trying to be really conscious of the shapes that you're making. So he just did it with his right hand, and the teacher was so astounded at the quality. Again, according to Lubalin, he was like, wow, you did so great. And that praise, Lubalin said, meant so much to him. He was finally kind of okay with something, and he took that really to heart. And he started really using letters and kind of found that this is my thing. This is something I'm kind of good at. And I think it just stayed with him. And I think when he started working in the field, when he finally landed in this like safe place that trusted him, and at this design agency that was doing pharma, these ideas of his love for letter form started, I think, rising to the surface, and he started really finding solutions within them. But I think the seed was planted by this, like, not just a pat on the back. You did okay, buddy. It was like, wow. And he said, it's basically was built on a fib. I just never owned up to the fact that I did it right-handed. He's like, I'll take the praise. I'll take the praise.
Well, and he worked right the way up to the very top of his of the art director profession, right? Which was like, the Don Draper kind of. Yeah, I mean, it was illustrious, right?
Yeah, he was up there. George Lois, who was in, the canon of, like, the madmen, although Lois dislikes that term because he's like, that's not really how it was. But certainly in the canon, George Lois worked with Lubalin at Sedler and Hennessy for a few years as a second art director alongside Lubalin. So they knew each other from the 50s, before Lois's career really took off. And I think it took off when he left that studio and kind of went to a couple of places, and he really found his. But I think
Esquire, man, that's the big thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in my conversations with Lois, he was so generous and so kind, and so he adored Lubalin. He said, like, he was just the sweetest person and meant a lot, I think, to him as a young man. And Lubalin was a little bit older than him, but I feel like Lois learned a lot about this idea of language and the power of language and the power of design through art direction. I think a lot of those ideas that he brought into advertising that placed them on the map was something that he saw from Lubalin's work. But you're absolutely right. Lubalin was up there in the big madman, like
canon. Yeah. Okay.
In the canon of these. Yeah, he got to the very, very top there by mid-50s. He was in the top ranks.
Which
to the point where Sedler and Hennessy added his name to the studio. The studio became Sedler and Hennessy Lubalin.
He does a lovely corporate identity package that features typography. Yeah, this kind of new L like addition sort of this form SH, beautifully kind of locked up. And what's interesting too about that, and I think it's worth saying just in the context of this conversation, that a lot of which was surprising to me, but a lot of the work that he's really well known for, the very expressive calligraphic stuff, including that lovely SH and L composition, was done by other people. It was his idea, though. No,
it was his idea. It was his inventiveness, and he's art directing it. But the execution was by the staff that he surrounded himself with, and he made sure that he had the best people in the country. And I also have to make it clear that Lubalin was always forthcoming with that. It wasn't a secret. That's how the trade was set up. But he always credited his people, the people that made this work,
the people that crafted it.
Yeah, like Tom Carnese did most of the famous logos, most of the famous calligraphic work, including the logo for Avant Garde. And Tom Carnese drew the typeface, Avant Garde Gothic. It was art directed by Lubalin, but the actual work of making those drawings of those letter forms was Tom.
Nice.
So, and Lubalin always made sure that he credited them in conversations. And also Tom Carnese was elevated to the partner level for about a decade. He was in the studio's name. The studio is Lubalin Smith Carnese. It's the longest incarnation of the longest name in Lubalin entities. He kept changing names because he was adding partners. But Tom Carnese's name was, on the door, on the business card. He was a full partner in the studio, and he was predominantly a lettering artist in the studio. He did most of the lettering heavy stuff. So he was like, I need an excellent letterer you're going to be a partner. You're going to be
Yeah.
in the room. That meant a lot.
Yeah. Again, I just think of William Morris and this whole idea of fulfillment in work, and not this idea of basically how can I exploit this person.
Yeah. He was mindful because I think he understood that was also, this is my speculation, but I think he understood that that was one way that he can keep them happy. Because the
Yes.
studio, when he left Sudler and Hennessy on the heels of Eros magazine design, he kind of embraced this freedom, this newfound freedom of having the carte blanche from Ralph Ginzburg to do whatever he wanted. I think he was like, wow, this is amazing. I don't want to do advertising. I want to do this.
Well, that's right. And you say that he never did like advertising. He's just trying to force stuff on people that, they don't really want,
Yeah, he said,
and
I don't like advertising because it makes people buy things that they don't need. It's
yes,
almost a verbatim
exactly.
quote from him. And I think he really found tension in that space by 62. And by 64, he was done and started his own studio. And I know that there's like a number of projects that he did, some of the more interesting or the more graphic, or I would say even some of the more famous pieces of his were work that he gave away to clients. He had people who were like, I would love, Herb, for you to design something for me, but I just could never afford you. And he's like, I'll just do it anyway.
That's the story that you tell about Sippy Pinelli's. You say that Ralph Ginzburg has this idea about doing these magazines. He figures that Herb's going to be too expensive, right?
Yeah.
But thankfully, he is directed to Herb, and Herb goes for it and takes a gigantic risk. He's at the top of his game, and here he is doing an erotic magazine.
Yeah, in the studio, in as a billing client in a relatively conservative studio. That like their clients were very small, medium-sized corporations. I think there was a ton of potential backlash that they could have faced. I mean, it's the classic.
You love that. You gotta love that ballsiness.
Yeah,
you do.
Yeah.
Love
I mean,
that.
I talked to his assistant, Faye Burrows, who was his very trusted assistant in Southern Hennessy, and I said, how did he do this? How did he convince the agency to bring in an erotic magazine?
Yes.
And she's like, he just had this faith, that they wouldn't have a problem, and they were like, we trust you. Yeah. And I said, like, was this really, like, did he do this at home, like, or in his quiet hours? She was like, no, this was a build. There were invoices.
The thing is, though, I mean, we look at it with today's eyes, and it's harmless. It's nothing. And even compared to Playboy at the time, it really wasn't. It wasn't much. Yeah. And we're getting right into the meat of our conversation here, because the reason that I'm talking to you is because Steve Heller sort of lit a flame about magazines, and then it was a slam dunk when Stephen LeMaison, the great magazine collector, I interviewed him, and this is what I love about what you've been doing with your presentations, is that you do combine, the lives and the work of these people, but you also mention the fact that you can pick this stuff up for nothing. And that's exactly what I've done. I got all the Avant Garde. I got the four Eros, and I'm now working on Fact magazine. In fact, I'm going to try and get a bunch of them before I put this out. Not that there weren't a lot of them, but still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible, and I think it makes me always surprised when I say this and I just encounter this, that like, to me it's like the best of Lubalin, and it's kind of under the radar, and I think it speaks to the way the history and the canon is constructed, the history of graphic design, the way it's told. And I think there's another, because I always wonder, why is there not a bigger attention in the design history books? And I think part of why I think that is that time. I think my sense, and I'm speculating, but this is just a theory that I have, is that when design history started to be really written, what happened in the 80s, early 80s, thereabout.
Megs, you mean Megs?
Megs, exactly.
Yeah,
And I think by that point, and Megs actually does a good job. He's one of the
yeah.
few writers in the series of design history books that have come out. He actually spends a good deal of time talking about Lubalin's in relationship to Eros, fact, and Avant Garde. Most other publications like show the Avant Garde maybe typeface, maybe the logo. That's like the only connection to Ginsburg that's made. And Megs actually kind of spends some amount of time talking about the relationship and also like the position of those magazines and how radical they were. But it's surprising how little depth is given. But I think by the 80s, that work has kind of was passe a little bit. It's kind of got like, oh, it's the New York School of Design. It just kind of gets lumped into. And I think Ginsburg's reputation by the 80s was suffering because of having gone to prison. I think he tried to rally his career after prison and sort of revive his space. He did a circuit of lectures. He tried to kickstart Avant Garde back up. And Ginsburg said it nearly bankrupted me. I couldn't afford it, and he completely just gave up and went into photojournalism.
What does that mean?
Ginsburg started. He kind of says it's almost like a paparazzi. He just realized that he needed to make a living.
Yeah.
He liked photography, and so he picked up the camera and started photographing and trying to place his work with tabloids. So he worked
And
with.
did he? I hope he didn't die in poverty.
The sense I have is that money never stayed with Ginsburg. I've always wondered like how he was able to finance such a lavish publication like Eros.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that he did something really smart. He got a job at Esquire magazine, and he got a job at Esquire magazine on the back of the research that he was doing into Comstock. And he placed this idea with I believe Gingrich was the publisher of Esquire at the time. He said he sold them on this idea. I have a story that I could write for you. And the story is the history of erotic literature. Because his research into Comstock led him to uncover how places like Library of Congress cataloged pornographic literature. They just were hiding it. They kept it. They figured out what the code was.
Right.
It wasn't in the P section in the index cards. And he started pulling together this like bibliography with some notes and comments. And he sold this as a possible idea to Gingrich as a story in Esquire. He's like, okay, I could see you got some ideas. So he got a job. The story never came to pass. And
you mean just one job, like one article, or he continued to write?
He got hired on the staff by showing him I had this idea. And Gingrich, I think, was like, look, you'll come and maybe now we own the story. We'll work on the story. You'll work on this, but also you'll get assignments. He did a good job, I guess, over some amount of years. And he got a raise, and he had a meeting with Gingrich Gingrich was going to tell him, like, I'm giving you a raise. And the way Ginsburg tells the story is like, I went into this meeting and he tells me, here's your raise. And Ginsburg is like, I don't want the raise. And Gingrich is like, what do you mean? It's a raise. You did well. He's like, I know that you're probably not going to run the story that I brought to you about the history of erotic literature. And he's like, yes, I don't think so. It's just not a good fit. Doesn't work. He's like, okay, how about I trade you the raise for the rights to that story? I take the rights back. No raise. And he's like, your money. Okay. Do you? And Ginsburg took the rights because I think he had lined up a publisher already by that point. So he had regained the rights to the story. He published the book. It sold, I think, 1 million copies. It did really, really well. I think it's called The Unhurried View of Erotica. And it was published in hardcover and then soft paperback. And I think he got a sizable advance. I think he had like a pretty good pile of money, all of which he used to finance Eros magazine. An interesting fact that he gave an interview the day before he went to prison in 1972. He gave a long interview to New York Times. They ran it in the magazine. The reporter spent a day with him because he was waiting for the call from the governor, potential call from the governor with the pardon. In that story, in the interview that he's saying, he's like, I was secretly glad that the magazine was shuttered after 4 issues, because he said, I don't think I would have had enough money after the 5th issue. We would have been bankrupt. And he was like, I was kind of glad that it was shut down by another entity and I couldn't afford it. So that's what I mean. I think money came and money went out. Money came, money went out, things. And I don't think that he was ever in a good place financially, but he did what he could. And I think his photojournalism, he was very proud of it. You know, he published a book of his photographs. It's called 365 Days in New York, I think. And so there's a photo for every day of the year, which is this like kind of funny idea. He also had a book of birds. He's photographing birds around New York. He put a book together of birds. He was trying, you know, he's really trying.
I love this guy. I mean, he's a great writer, and he's creative, and he goes into some expressing himself with photography after. It's like, it's just wonderful.
Yeah. Because the Eros case, he was convicted. Because of the losing the case to a Goldwater, I think his reputation was in tatters, and I think people were like, "Oh, that guy. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Do you went to prison and he lost his case? I don't. Yeah. So I think he suffered from that, and I think that's why.
Which is exactly what the establishment wanted.
Yes, they got exactly what they set out to do, to destroy his career.
Yeah. Well, marginalized, but also, paint him as a kook or a pervert or whatever.
Yeah. And it was intentional on the part of Bobby Kennedy.
Yes, you talk about in one of the issues of Eros that. Yeah, well, you tell the story.
Yeah, the second issue, the summer issue of 62, second volume of Eros, the first feature is on John Kennedy. And the feature is called We All Love Jack, which I think is also very interesting that they choose to use Jack. Yeah. He's the sitting president. And it could be read two ways. Like, it's disrespectful. John Kennedy, JFK, there are lots of things they could say. But I think it's actually a way to humanize that figure. He's not a president as an idea. He's a human, flesh and blood, and he's handsome. He's attractive.
And he's horny.
Yes. Right. Stuff that is like kind of public knowledge. So they run this feature showing Kennedy in a photo series, essentially, of Kennedy with women. And there's a very striking photo of Jack and Grace Kelly. And Grace Kelly sort of like, you know, giving him this like look.
Gazing adoration is what it is.
And he's also like in that photo, it's a brilliant photo because he's just kind of like oblivious. He's like pointing something out. This is like just outside the White House.
Yeah.
As a state visit from the princess. Grace was the princess of Monaco at the time. And it's just so telling. It's like he's just in his own little bubble, but he exudes this charm and attractiveness, and people are just completely drawn to him. And it's genius. And the best part about it, all those photos were from photo agencies. They're not paparazzis. They're just, you know, stuff that everybody had access to. And when that story came out, Bobby Kennedy was, he was not thrilled. He was not thrilled that his brother, you know, this paints him in this like very unsavory light. So he just had an axe to grind. And the biography of Bobby Kennedy, written by his aide, talks to that moment. And the aide talks about how conflicted Bobby felt. By the 4th issue, they felt he went too far, but not far enough. There's like going to be a hard case to make. But the aide in this book says, I advised Bobby Kennedy by saying this: Ralph Ginzburg wants you to come after him. This is the tactic that he's playing. If he hasn't done the thing that is punishable yet, he will. So do it now before it's too late, before it's all embarrassing for everybody. And so he speculates that was the reason that Bobby was like, okay, because they went around the censor. The censor didn't censor this 4th issue, but Ralph Ginzburg was indicted on 27 federal criminal charges, despite the fact that the magazine wasn't censored. And the magazine was censored unofficially censored internally by Bobby Kennedy on the pretext of the fact that the interracial photographs in the magazine were going to cause too much noise and too much problems for the Kennedys in their push for civil rights, that they just felt like they have to make this go away.
Yeah, this is a kind of tells you that it's not a simple decision. There's all sorts of complexities involved as to why they didn't go ahead and press charges. But so Ginsburg he fights this in court for 10 years, right?
Yeah, the actual legal battle, I think, for him was shorter, just because of procedure and kind of the timing and the slowness of how the legal system kind of works. But I think his Supreme Court appeal, which I think was heard twice, the ruling by the Supreme Court, which I think they appealed, which was denied, they all happened, I think, around 68, 69, something like that. And then he was finally sort of, the conviction was upheld. And he was at that point, I think, just trying to see what else he had. And I think at that point was just lobbying the governor. Okay. But he had a sentencing date, and he was actually his last appeal to the Supreme Court. They were lenient. They reduced his 5-year prison sentence to 3. So I think like in those years between like 68, 69 to 72, when he went to prison, he was trying to kind of lower the time, and he was hoping for a pardon, which never came. But he spent 10 years essentially on bail, fighting this case. And in 72, he goes to prison, which is also, everything in America changed by 72.
Yeah. Which made it even more kind of absurd.
Exactly. And I think he was trying to be very vocal about, like, why is this still happening to me?
Well, and the other thing I think that he was upset about, as you tell it, is that the mainstream media just didn't come to his rescue. They just ignored him. And in fact, that's what prompted the next magazine after Eros.
Yeah.
And again, this is such a fascinating magazine story. I'm so happy to have the issues that I have, thanks to you, incidentally, just prompting me to go out and get them. But as you say, this is a period, and these 3 magazines are, well, it's part of magazine lore, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's surprising how little attention these 3 publications are given in the history of American magazines, but they're so pivotal. And
because of this censorship issue?
I think so. I think predominantly the fact that he was convicted, and he lost the case against, or he lost the case to Goldwater. I think it just basically like washed the publication, discredited his credibility.
Fact.
For fact. And I think Avant Garde was too, I think, like kooky for most people at the time. I think it was like seen as like a very hippie kind of thing, like that didn't have substance, but it's incredible in substance. I think Ginsburg was a really good editor, he had a really good sense of articles. Not all. There's also, unfortunately, some homophobia that slips through in Fact magazine. So, I think he was generous and progressive, you could say, for his time, but with certain like blind spots. For sure. Yeah. Right. So I think like that's important to acknowledge, but he had a really good sense of good articles. He was truly a good editor and a writer. And I think he really had a good knack for finding these things. And so the public hasn't really had a chance to look at them closely and to really kind of reassess the actual content of these. And I think because his reputation suffered, like the mainstream just made a mockery of him. The government did a very shrewd thing of painting him as a pornographer.
Yes.
And that was a very easy button in the time to really press. And the fact that the Eros case was tried in Philadelphia is just astounding and so insidious, because there's nothing related to Pennsylvania except for a kind of, I would say, maybe foolish decision. I'm sure Ginsburg regretted it, but he went to the town of Intercourse in Pennsylvania to ask the postmaster if he would mail Eros magazines, because he knew that he planned to have the magazines mailed in a brown envelope. He just wanted the postmark from
Yeah,
intercourse.
that's just so in your face, ballsy, and
Yeah,
almost over the top. Almost
over the
over the
top.
top.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
but Philadelphia at the time, the mayor of Philly was elected on the campaign to rid the city of smut. So they were like, he went to
right.
Pennsylvania. Let's have the case in a federal court in Philly, and we'll get a shoe in because we'll get the jury. And his lawyers, Ginsburg's lawyers, advised him not to go with the jury. They said, go with the judge, and the judge was, in a way, kind of worse because he was very blatantly biased. Like there
Yeah.
are instances in the transcript of the court case where the judge interrupts the witness and steps in for the prosecution and grills very, very much leads the witness. It's like,
Well, and the great thing is that judge's name is Body.
yeah.
Well, just sort of winding down here, they're just and getting back to Herb Lubalin. First of all, I've got this. I'm just holding up. It's not the first one. He redesigns in late '61. He redesigns the Saturday Evening Post. So again, putting on my collector's hat, I want to get those early ones.
Yeah.
And again, they're not hard to find. Yeah, then Herb works on the Facts and then Avant Garde. Then he starts up upper and lower case, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about that?
Herb had a business relationship with Aaron Burns, who was a very influential person in the typesetting industry. A lot of jobs that Herb did that were kind of the more special or kind of jobs that required like really precise typesetting craftsmanship, he usually worked with Aaron because he knew they were on the same page for that. So they had conceived of this idea that they could also have a business where they would handle typesetting for other clients. As a studio, they would take jobs and then also handle the typesetting, which means that they were also keeping profits. They're kind of profiting off of the bigger part of it. As part of that work, they started using some of the lettering for some of the jobs that they did, turning them into fonts and then selling them, offering them to other clients. And one of the typefaces that they did this with was the lettering for the Avant Garde logo, which they turned into the typeface, Avant Garde Gothic. By the time Avant Garde Gothic was ready in 1970, they had created a company called International Typeface Corporation, ITC, because they were like, we have this amazing catalog of typefaces that clients really want. Let's just build a whole industry around it. So they created, using that sort of logo, this with these joining forms, and created this like expanded set of ligatures and kind of letters that are intertwining. And it was very popular, and they made a very successful business out of it on the back of these fonts. And Aaron realized that there was what do we do for marketing? How do we market these things? Everyone just sends out little catalogs with samples. They're quite boring. And I think because of Herb's interest in magazines, he conceived with Aaron this idea of like, let's make a magazine and give it away to people. The magazine would only use our typefaces, so we can show people how to use them, how to use them well, and let's give them something to read. Stories about design, stories about typography, stories about so it's a trade publication that speaks the language of these studios and art directors, and also gives them like the marketing pitch of, these are cool fonts, you should use these fonts, because every page of UNLC at the bottom credited, this page uses this and this and this typeface from ITC. And it was a genius move because it allowed them to create another vehicle where they can experiment. Herb could like play around and have carte blanche, which he had with Ginsburg. And this is 1974, so by that point they're not working together with Ralph, or they're working on a couple of pieces like quietly. They're not very expressive, but he maintained some projects with Ralph, but the big ones, Avant Garde, was over by then. So he needed, I think, like another platform, another place. And what Herb did is he became the editor of UNLC. So he was both editing, kind of, I think, like Ralph. He was like, this is fun. I get to choose things, I get to write things, I get to frame things, I have ideas. Like, let's create a column. They had a column called MS, Dodd. I think like not in the first issue, but very quickly, I'm not sure if it's the first year or the second year of the publication, where they were highlighting women in the field, women in design, women in lettering. So he understands his position, I think, genuinely, of power and giving space to people that are not talked about. It's certainly in the 70s, women were like somewhat still marginalized in the design industry, underpaid. So he was like, let's talk about the wonderful women who are making this work, and let's give them kind of a spotlight. So I think it was a really interesting period for him, and I think he spent a big part of his life creatively in the studio, focusing on UNLC design from 73, 74, I think is when it started, all the way to 81 when he passed away.
He's lucky. He kind of sidestepped this pornographer label.
Yeah, he was, I think, very lucky that nothing really came, because, and also tellingly, like the government just really focused, locked in, like, Ralph, this is the person we really need to.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't really about the magazine. It was actually not about the content. It was about the person behind the content. Let's go after them. When Ginsburg approached Lubalin to design Fact magazine, my understanding is that Herb told him, I am so sorry that you're the one being targeted for this. And he didn't charge Ginsburg for the design services of doing Fact magazine, even though that was one of the first projects probably he picked up as a new studio. He created his own studio, and like one of the first thing he does is give work away, which you need the money, and he's giving work. But I think he felt so guilty and responsible, because there's a number of things that Herb certainly influenced in the publication. Like I know that the Marilyn Monroe photographs were in that third issue of Eros because he had a personal relationship with Bert Stern. They had worked together, so he had an in to Bert, and he found out about the X's, the marks that Marilyn had made on her photos, and he was like, this is intriguing, this is a really good story. I think he helped negotiate the licensing, or whatever the agreement was, to get those photos. So Herb, I think, played a much bigger role in the magazine, even on an editorial level, than he gave himself credit. In interviews, he usually says, the couple of times he's asked about Eros, he's like, it was a job. I was hired to do a job, and I try to do the best job I can. And he kind of just distances himself a little bit. But I know for a fact, like, I think his involvement was much more hands-on and a little bit more direct in the editorial angle or some of the stories. So I think he was like, we did this together, kind of. Like, and you get to suffer for it. I hope you don't go to prison, but let me give you at least something. Here's a design for free.
Well, I just want to thank you, Sasha, for giving us such a great description of these two men behind the content. It's a wonderful story, and I'm going to snap up as many of these magazines before this goes on air as I can.
I'm glad to hear that, Nigel. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you about this, because as you said, like, I genuinely feel very passionate about this, because I find a lot of inspiration, and you said this at the very beginning, like, I think we're in a very particularly fraught times where these ideas and these individuals could and should be an inspiration to how we live our lives today in the context of the aggression that my family is experiencing in Ukraine right now. So I feel like there's some lessons and maybe a little bit of modeling of how to be in a particularly tricky time, which the 60s, were Vietnam, everything before. So there's some really good things that I think we can learn and be inspired by some of these individuals. And so I hope that carries, and hope people feel like inspired.
Well, it's been inspiring talking to you, I must say. So thanks again. Sasha Tochilovsky is a designer, typographer, instructor, and curator at the Cooper Union's Herb Lubalin Center of Design and Typography in New York City. Thanks again for your time. It's been great.
My pleasure, Nigel. My pleasure.
Now, Sasha, do you just focus on Lubalin, or do you know more about, like, because I want to go nuts on magazines. I've gone nuts on books for the last more than 10 years. And
I
I've missed them.
do. Yeah, I do. I mean, like if I would love for you to visit us one day soon to see, because we have a collection, I would say like maybe 2,000 pieces of Lubalin's work, because that's kind of as much as I think volume, but the collection is about 70,000 pieces overall. So we have 125 years of design here, and a very good collection of magazines, and some very fun, obscure, interesting magazines. Part of my job in a way is to seek things that are interesting, that fill certain holes in the collection, that speak to time, place, makers, ideas, themes. And the other part of my job is to kind of know as much as I can, if I can, about these objects, because we're a public facing institution. Like, we have about 3,000 people coming through our doors every year. We're open to the public. We have an open archive. So when people come in and say, I'm looking for pieces that talk to 1960s New York hotel culture, this easily can happen. And I need to know which pieces we have that will highlight that for them. It's part of my just like human like nature. Like, I'm super inquisitive about everything. Just like, what is this? So it's just like my own curiosity, but also like I feel like I need to make the connections for. And I that example I gave you is like an actual request. We had a small design team come in from New York City studio that were working on the design of a hotel in New York that wanted to have like a 60s New York vibe. So they're like, what does that look like? Show us that. So I was like, okay, so here's like this. Let's look at like this from this angle, from here. And I just kind of need to know like where these ideas might reside, because it's not just like, let's look at photos of hotels in the 60s. It's like other things that, and because my training is graphic design, like that's how I think designers work. And so I'm like, I know what you're looking for. So I'm like, okay, so it's not just this. I know that your arc is like this. So let me like find the things that fit to this arc of. So yeah,
Well, you know what's so great about that is that you really are putting this collection to use, which is what you want with a collection, obviously, right? You don't want it to just sit there and get dust on it. You want to get it out and use it and
because those things are made to be consumed, and for them to be gathering dust, like that is, basically completely eliminating its initial function. Even though it's old, just because it's old doesn't mean it's not relevant. And it actually maybe helps us like overcome some of these misunderstandings or these like willing distortions of history.
Well, and help make the world a better place, really.
Exactly. That would be a good goal for all of us to have.
Very good. Well, hopefully this will create a bit more work for you and more people coming into the center.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And I really appreciate the platform, Nigel.
Very good. Okay. Well, thanks again for your time.
Pleasure to talk to you.